In a city where power ruled every street corner and hearts were taught to hide behind ambition, one young woman stepped off a train with nothing but a resume, a paper cup of coffee, and a fragile kind of hope. Her name was Grace Miller, ordinary, uncertain, and desperate for a chance. She only wanted a simple secretary job, but destiny had other plans. What happens when an ordinary girl crosses paths with a man known as the Ice King of Chicago, a millionaire CEO feared by rivals, respected by all, and trusted by none? This is not just a love story. It's a story of courage of a woman who dared to stay kind in a world built on power. A story of redemption, of a man who learned that love isn't weakness. It's strength reborn. Stay with us. Because sometimes, the smallest decisions lead us to the most extraordinary places, and one interview can change a life forever. It was one of those mornings when the city of Chicago seemed to breathe light. The early train rolled into Union Station with a low metallic sigh, carrying hundreds of stories, some ending, some just beginning. Golden sunlight spilled between the tall glass towers, painting them in shades of warmth that only lasted for a few fleeting minutes. The air smelled of roasted coffee and the sharp scent of newspaper ink. Somewhere, a saxophone player was warming up on the street corner, his music mingling with the hum of traffic. Among the morning rush stepped Grace Miller, a young woman clutching a folder of resumes in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. Her fingers trembled just a little, though she tried to hide it. She had chosen her best blouse cream-colored, freshly ironed, and the same black heels she'd worn to her high school graduation. They pinched her feet, but she didn't mind. Today mattered. Grace had arrived on the overnight train from Bloomington, Indiana, her small hometown that still woke to the sound of church bells and lawnmowers. It had been years since she'd felt so far from home. Back there, her mother's illness had slowly turned the house quiet, a different kind of silence, the kind filled with worry and unpaid bills. Her mother's voice still echoed in her mind, soft and firm all at once. Don't let the world harden you. Gracie, be kind, but be brave too. And so, she'd packed her dreams into a single suitcase, saved up from waitressing tips and part-time work, and come here to Chicago chasing a single chance. A secretary position at Caldwell Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. The building was only 6 blocks from the station, yet every step felt heavier than the last. The streets were alive with rhythm, the sharp clicks of heels, the blare of horns, the wind rushing off the lake. Skyscrapers rose like silent giants, and Grace felt smaller than she ever had before. But beneath that fear was something else, a stubborn ember of hope. She whispered to herself, so quietly that even she barely heard it. You can do this. Grace. At the crosswalk. She waited beside a woman in a red coat holding a designer purse. The woman glanced at Grace, then looked away. It was a small thing, but it reminded Grace of the invisible lines dividing the world, those who belonged, and those still trying to find their place. She tightened her grip on her resume. It wasn't perfect, no fancy degrees, no corporate experience, just determination, a steady work ethic, a story written in long nights and quiet sacrifices. The Caldwell Tower came into view, 40 stories of mirrored glass that caught the morning sun and threw it back at the city like fire. Grace stopped at the base of the steps, her breath catching. For a brief second, she thought about turning around, buying a return ticket, pretending this morning had never happened. But then she remembered the look on her mother's face when she'd promised to make things better. She couldn't go back. Not yet. Inside the lobby, the marble floors gleamed under chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls. Men in tailored suits passed by, talking in low voices, their shoes clicking like metronomes. Grace stood still, overwhelmed. Her reflection in the glass doors looked too ordinary, too breakable for a place like this. But she smiled anyway, a small, fragile smile that carried every ounce of courage she had left. The receptionist greeted her politely, scanning the appointment list. Then came the first ripple in her day, a frown. "There's no interview for secretarial applicants today," the woman said. Grace blinked, confused. She pulled out the email again, her voice trembling slightly as she read it. There must have been a mistake. And yet, in that single moment of uncertainty, fate began to shift so quietly she didn't even notice. Somewhere in the higher floors of this building, Ethan Caldwell, the company's CEO, a man newspapers called the Ice King of Chicago, was about to change her life forever. But Grace didn't know that yet. Right now, she was just a young woman standing in the middle of a grand lobby, clutching her resume like a shield. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the city, quick, uncertain, but alive. She took one step forward, then another. Each step carried a silent promise to herself, to her mother, to the life she hoped to build. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. She stepped inside, pressed the button for the top floor, and watched as the numbers climbed. 10, 15, 22, 30, outside. The city stretched endlessly, a sea of light and glass. And somewhere deep inside her, courage began to stir. You can do this, Grace. Because sometimes, destiny doesn't arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes, it begins quietly on a train, in the morning light, carried by a young woman who refuses to give up. The elevator slowed to a stop on the 38th floor, and for a moment, Grace Miller could hear nothing but the faint hum of electricity behind the walls. She straightened her blouse, smoothed the edges of her resume, and took a breath so deep it almost steadied her heart. When the doors slid open, the world changed again. The hallway before her was silent and sleek, the kind of space where even footsteps felt like an interruption. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan glimmering in the morning sun. Every surface gleamed. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and fresh ink. Grace stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble. It was a far cry from the worn wooden floors of her mother's kitchen back home, where sunlight fell through lace curtains and dust motes danced like slow snow. Here, everything seemed measured, deliberate, expensive. Even the silence had a price tag. She approached the reception desk, a curved stretch of frosted glass, where a young woman with perfect hair and a flawless manicure looked up from her screen. Grace smiled nervously. "Good morning," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm here for the secretary interview. Grace Miller." The receptionist's polite smile faltered. "Secretary interview." She glanced at her computer again, frowning. "I don't have anything scheduled for that position today." Grace blinked, unsure if she'd misheard. She opened her folder, hands trembling as she pulled out the printed email confirmation. It said, October 16th, 9:30 a.m., she explained, her words gentle but firm. The receptionist looked again this time, more carefully, and shook her head, offering an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Ms. Miller. There must be some mistake." For a few heartbeats, Grace didn't move. The air around her felt heavier, the dream she had carried on the train suddenly slipping away like fog under sunlight. She could almost hear her brother Daniel's voice in her head, the one that always doubted her city dreams. "You should have stayed home, Gracie." But before disappointment could take root, a new voice broke through the tension. Grace Miller. Grace turned. A tall woman approached early 50s, with silver strands in her dark hair and eyes that saw everything before she even spoke. Her presence filled the hallway like quiet authority. "I'm Linda Barrett," she said, extending a hand. "Director of Human Resources." Grace shook her hand quickly, trying to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. "I'm so sorry," Linda continued, glancing at the receptionist's screen. "It seems there's been a scheduling error." But she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps this was meant to happen." Grace frowned slightly. "Meant to happen?" Linda offered a knowing smile. "Our CEO's personal secretary resigned unexpectedly this morning. It's a demanding position, not one we typically fill on short notice. But your resume came across my desk, and..." She studied Grace thoughtfully. "You might be exactly what we need." Grace's breath caught. The CEO's personal secretary. That couldn't be right. She wasn't qualified for something like that. This was supposed to be a simple interview, answer a few questions, maybe type a few letters, not walk into the orbit of one of the most powerful men in Chicago. I appreciate the thought. She began carefully. But I think there's been a mistake. I'm not. Linda raised a hand gently. You're nervous. That's normal. But I've been doing this long enough to know when someone belongs in a room they didn't expect to enter. Her voice carried the kind of calm that came from years of making impossible decisions. She looked at Grace the way a teacher might look at a student on the edge of discovery. The CEO will want to meet you personally, Linda added, if you're willing. Grace hesitated. Every sensible thought told her to decline, to go back downstairs, to find the next train home. But something deep inside whispered the same quiet words that had carried her this far. You can do this, Grace. So, she nodded. All right, she said softly. I'll stay. Linda smiled the kind of smile that understood courage when it saw it. Good. Follow me. As they walked, Grace couldn't help but glance at the framed photos lining the corridor, black and white images of construction sites, newspaper clippings, and the stern face of a man standing beside the original Caldwell Tower blueprint. It was a legacy built on precision, ambition, and control. At the far end of the hall, two massive glass doors stood half open. Beyond them, she could see a faint outline, a tall figure standing by the window, back turned, skyline behind him. Linda stopped and turned to Grace. This is Mr. Caldwell's office, she said quietly. He doesn't like to waste time. Speak honestly, and don't be intimidated. He values that. Grace nodded, her pulse quickening. Honesty, that she could do. Just breathe. Just be yourself. Linda gave her a reassuring nod and opened the door. The world beyond the threshold seemed to shift colder air, quieter sound, the faint scent of cedar and ink. Grace stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. That was how it began the moment her path crossed with Ethan Caldwell, the man Chicago called the Ice King. She didn't know it yet, but that single twist of fate, one mistaken appointment, would unravel everything she thought she knew about success, loyalty, and love. Sometimes, destiny doesn't knock. Sometimes, it walks right up to the front desk and calls your name. The office door closed behind Grace with a quiet click. And just like that, the noise of the world, the elevators, the phones, the footsteps in the hallway disappeared. For a long moment, all she could hear was the low hum of the city far below, muffled through glass. Morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, scattering across dark mahogany shelves lined with books and silver awards. The air smelled faintly of cedar, leather, and freshly brewed espresso power, captured and distilled. Then he turned. Ethan Caldwell. The name alone carried weight in Chicago, the man behind the skyline, the ruthless strategist, the youngest CEO ever to take Caldwell Enterprises public. People called him the Ice King. And in that instant, Grace understood why. He was impeccably dressed, not a thread out of place. A tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a steel gray tie that matched the color of his eyes sharp, controlled, and unreadable. Those eyes met hers, cool and assessing, as if measuring the worth of everything they touched. Grace felt the air grow heavier, though he hadn't spoken a single word yet. Her instinct told her that this was not a man easily impressed. Miss Miller, he said finally, his voice low, smooth, and precise, the kind of voice that filled a room without ever needing to rise. Sit down. She obeyed, placing her resume carefully on the glass desk before her. It was spotless, no clutter, no loose papers, just a fountain pen, a closed laptop, and a framed photo turned face down. He glanced at her resume only briefly before setting it aside. You're not from the city, he said. It wasn't a question. No, sir, she replied softly. Bloomington, Indiana. His expression didn't change. And you've never worked in corporate administration before. No, sir. But he raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. What made you apply to Caldwell Enterprises? Grace hesitated. She could say something polished, something that sounded like ambition. But when she met his gaze again, the truth slipped out before she could stop it. I needed a new beginning, she said, and I thought, maybe this could be it. Ethan studied her, eyes narrowing slightly, as if the word beginning carried a meaning he understood all too well. He leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together. Do you know what this job entails? I understand it's demanding, Grace said, but I learn fast. I don't give up easily. His lips twitched, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. He stood and walked toward the window, speaking without turning. People usually do give up, Miss Miller. They last a few months, maybe less. They think this office is about power and privilege. It's not. He turned then, his eyes catching the light. It's about endurance. Grace held his gaze, and for the first time, he seemed to notice something behind her, calm, a steadiness that didn't come from the confidence, but from survival. He moved closer, resting one hand on the desk. What's the hardest thing you've ever had to do? Grace thought for a moment. It wasn't an interview question, not really. It was a test. She swallowed. Watching someone you love get sick, she said quietly. Knowing you can't fix it, only hold on until the next day. Ethan didn't speak right away. For a flicker of a second, his expression shifted, something almost human breaking through the precision. Then, it was gone. He picked up her resume again, tapping it once against the desk. You're honest, he said finally. That's rare. Grace wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. I'll be direct, he continued. My personal secretary handles every call, every document, every schedule. I don't repeat instructions. I don't tolerate mistakes. Can you handle that? Yes, she said without hesitation. His brow lifted slightly. You didn't even think about it. I've had enough time to doubt myself. Mr. Caldwell, she said softly. I'd rather not waste more of it. That earned her the faintest smile, or maybe she imagined it. He extended a hand across the desk. Then you start tomorrow. Grace blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Tomorrow. Unless you prefer to change your mind. She stood, shaking his hand firm, steady, hiding the tremor she felt inside. His palm was warm, but his touch brief, businesslike. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. Miss Miller. She looked back. Sir Punctuality, he said simply. 8 o'clock sharp. Grace nodded, a small smile forming. Yes, Mr. Caldwell. She stepped out into the hallway, the door closing gently behind her, and only then did she allow herself a slow exhale, the kind that releases a week's worth of tension. Linda Barrett was waiting just outside, an amused glint in her eyes. Well, she asked. Grace shook her head, almost in disbelief. I just got the job. Linda's smile deepened. Then welcome to Caldwell Enterprises. Miss Miller, you've just joined the most demanding position in Chicago. As Grace rode the elevator down, the city shimmered through the glass, a landscape of ambition and secrets. She felt both exhilarated and terrified, as if she'd stepped into a story she wasn't quite ready to live. You can do this. Grace. And somewhere, 40 floors above. Ethan Caldwell watched the skyline in silence, the faint trace of curiosity still lingering behind his eyes. He didn't know why that small-town girl had stayed on his mind, but something about her composure, her quiet honesty, had cracked a line through the ice he'd spent years perfecting. Neither of them knew it yet, but the storm had already begun. Grace Miller's first week at Caldwell Enterprises began like stepping into a storm, not of wind or thunder, but of constant motion, deadlines, and the quiet pressure of perfection. After that first interview with Ethan Caldwell, the Ice King of Chicago, she had expected formality, structure, maybe even a little warmth once she proved herself. Instead, she found herself inside a world that moved faster than she could breathe. By 7:30 each morning, the office lights were already on. By 8, Ethan was at his desk, jacket perfectly tailored, pen in hand, as if he hadn't slept at all. Grace learned quickly that his days began before sunrise and ended long after most of Chicago had gone to sleep. Her own schedule became a reflection of his. Meetings at dawn, calls with investors that stretched past midnight, flights booked, canceled, then rebooked, notes rewritten, files double-checked, presentations color-coded by urgency. It was exhausting, yet strangely exhilarating. The first few days, she stumbled. A meeting invitation sent to the wrong department, a travel itinerary missing one connecting flight. She'd expected a reprimand, a sharp tone, perhaps even dismissal, but Ethan had simply looked at her, those gray eyes steady, cold, unflinching, and said, "Fix it, not cruelly, not kindly, just a command." And she had. Each mistake became a lesson. Each day. She found herself moving a little faster, understanding his rhythm, anticipating his thoughts before he spoke them. By the end of the week, she knew his habits, the way he liked his coffee strong but not sweet, the way he frowned when numbers didn't align, the way he loosened his tie by exactly 1 inch after a tense meeting. She even began to notice the small, silent things, the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand when he thought no one was watching. He never smiled, not once, but sometimes, late in the evening, when the rest of the office had gone home and only the hum of the city remained, she'd glance through the glass wall of his office and see him sitting there, head bowed, staring at a single page as though the weight of the entire world rested on it. He worked through dinner. He worked through fatigue. And when she brought him coffee, her quiet offering of peace, he would accept it without looking up, murmuring, "Thank you," like a man who had forgotten how gratitude was supposed to sound. Grace had met people who hid from pain before. Her mother used to hide hers behind smiles. Ethan hid his behind work, relentless, merciless work. He hides behind the work. I know that kind of loneliness. There was something heartbreakingly familiar about that kind of silence, the kind that said, "I can't stop," or "I'll fall apart." Still, she never asked. She never crossed the invisible line between professional and personal. Instead, she spoke through gestures, the second cup of coffee left beside his desk, the files she organized more carefully than anyone asked her to, the small reminders she slipped into his planner to make his days just a little easier. And, slowly, she began to feel that he noticed. One night, close to 11, she stood by the window outside his office, ready to leave. The city below glittered like 1,000 tiny lives, still awake taxis moving like fireflies. The lake, a dark mirror beyond the skyline. Ethan's voice broke through the quiet. "You should go home," he said, without looking up from his laptop. Grace hesitated. "So should you." He glanced up then, just a flicker, and for the briefest moment, the cold in his eyes softened. "I'm used to it," he said simply. "I used to tell my mom that too," Grace replied, voice almost a whisper. "She never believed me either." That earned her a pause. He didn't respond, but she saw something shift, the faintest crease in his expression, like a man caught remembering something he'd tried to forget. When she left that night, the office lights behind her glowed dimly through the rain, and she realized something important. She wasn't just learning how to be a secretary. She was learning how to understand a man who had built walls so tall even his own reflection couldn't climb over them. By the end of the week, she'd found her rhythm, the steady beat of organization, efficiency, grace under pressure. But she'd also found something else, something she couldn't quite explain, a quiet sense of purpose. It wasn't about admiration. It wasn't even attraction, not yet. It was something simpler, deeper, the pull of empathy, of seeing another soul and recognizing its wounds. When she lay in bed that weekend, too tired to move, she thought about him, about his silence, his sleepless eyes, and the way he always stood by the window like he was waiting for something that never came. She didn't know his story. She didn't need to. Sometimes, Knowing the shape of someone's loneliness was enough. He hides behind the work. I know that kind of loneliness. And maybe, just maybe, that was why fate had brought her there, not just to organize his life, but to remind him that even the coldest hearts could still be seen. The next week would bring new storms, harder, darker, more personal. But for now, under the steady hum of the city, Grace Miller slept, unaware that her small acts of kindness had already begun to melt the edges of the ice. Sometimes, the greatest changes begin quietly, with nothing more than a cup of coffee left on a lonely man's desk. The second week at Caldwell Enterprises bled into the third. Days turned into a blur of meetings, emails, and deadlines, the rhythm of corporate life pulsing endlessly. Grace had learned to anticipate Ethan Caldwell's every need, yet she still couldn't anticipate him. He remained an enigma, calm, composed, distant, a man carved out of focus and discipline. And yet, sometimes, in the late hours when the building had emptied and only the nightlights shimmered on the glass, she felt that something inside him was unraveling. That night, Chicago was quiet. The rain had passed, leaving streaks of silver on the windows. Grace had stayed late, finishing a final set of reports before shutting down her computer. She turned off the lamp at her desk, the soft click echoing in the silence, but when she looked toward Ethan's office, a thin line of light still glowed under the door. He was still there. For a moment, she hesitated. It wasn't her place to interrupt, but something, maybe intuition, maybe compassion, urged her to knock. The sound was gentle, respectful. She waited. "Come in," his voice said, rougher than usual. Grace stepped inside. Ethan sat behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. In front of him lay a spread of papers, untouched coffee, and two photographs, one of an older man with the same sharp jawline, the other of a woman Grace didn't recognize. He didn't look up right away. For the first time since she'd met him, he seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but inwardly, as if the weight of something unseen had finally pushed through the armor. "I didn't realize you were still here," she said quietly. Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. Apparently neither did I. Grace glanced at the photo of the older man. "Your father." He nodded slowly. "He built this company. From the ground up, every brick, every deal, every sleepless night." His voice was low, steady, but beneath it ran something unspoken. "When he died, I promised I wouldn't let it fall apart." Grace moved closer, standing beside the desk, her hands clasped loosely. "You've done more than that," she said softly. "You've made it stronger." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "At what cost?" He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the second photo. The woman, she was elegant, smiling, her eyes alive in a way that made the room feel suddenly colder. "She taught me that ambition can be cruel," he murmured. "Vanessa, she was someone I trusted, someone who taught me what failure really feels like." Grace didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. The way he said her name, quiet, edged with regret, told her everything she needed to know. He looked at the window then, the city's reflection shimmering faintly across his face. "People think control protects you," he said, "but it's just another kind of cage." Grace felt something stir inside her, a resonance, deep and familiar. She thought of her mother, sitting in a small Indiana kitchen, fighting through pain with nothing but faith and stubborn love. "My mom used to say that," Grace whispered. "That control doesn't keep you safe, it just keeps you alone." Ethan turned his head toward her, studying her face. There was no pity there, no calculation, just truth. "What happened to her?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled faintly, her eyes lowering. "She's still fighting," she said. "She has a heart condition. Some days are harder than others, but she never complains. She just keeps going." Her voice wavered, but she caught herself, steadying the tremor. "She taught me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing to get up again, even when you don't want to. Ethan didn't respond right away. He just sat there, his expression unreadable, but softer now, the sharp edges dulled by something human. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "She sounds remarkable?" "She is," Grace replied with a small smile. "She's why I'm here." Something passed between them, then fragile, quiet, but real. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition. Two people who had spent years hiding their pain behind duty, suddenly standing in the same emotional light. He hides behind the work. I know that kind of loneliness. And in that silence, she understood him a little more, the man behind the legend, the boy behind the burden. After a long moment, Ethan exhaled and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You should go home, Miss Miller," he said quietly. "It's late." "So should you," she answered softly. A corner of his mouth lifted the faintest, most human of smiles. "Maybe tomorrow." She nodded, gathering her things. But before leaving, she glanced back at the desk at the photo of his father and the woman named Vanessa. Two ghosts, two stories, both carved into the lines of his face. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Good night, Grace," he replied. It was the first time he had ever said her name. She stepped into the empty hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly behind her. The light in his office flickered once, then dimmed, and though she couldn't see it, Ethan sat there long after she'd gone, his fingers resting on the edge of the photo, his mind tracing the quiet courage of a woman who had reminded him, just for a moment, what kindness felt like. Sometimes, it only takes one honest conversation to melt years of silence. That night, as rain began to fall again over the city, something unseen cracked not loudly, not suddenly, but softly, like ice beginning to thaw. The night of that quiet conversation lingered in Grace's mind long after it ended. For the first time, she'd seen Ethan Caldwell not as the Ice King of Chicago, but as a man tired, wounded, and deeply human. Something in that moment had shifted, though neither of them said a word about it. The following days passed in a strange calm. Their work continued fast-paced, relentless but beneath the professional rhythm. A subtle thread of understanding had formed, a shared silence that didn't feel empty anymore. And then, just as Grace began to believe she understood the man behind the title, the past came back uninvited, wearing red heels and a perfect smile. It was late morning when the elevator doors opened and Vanessa Moore stepped into the executive floor. Even the air seemed to change with her arrival. She was elegance personified, tall, poised, her perfume faint and expensive. Every detail of her presence spoke of control, the curve of her lipstick, the measured click of her heels, the way her eyes scanned the office like she still owned a part of it. Grace looked up from her desk, instinctively straightening. Something in her stomach tightened. "Is Mr. Caldwell available?" Vanessa asked, her tone smooth but commanding, as if she'd never learned the word no. Grace hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" Ma'am Vanessa's red lips curved into a faint, dismissive smile. "I don't need one." Before Grace could respond, Ethan's voice came from behind his office door. "Let her in." He'd heard her. He always did. Vanessa pushed open the glass doors and walked in like a storm that had finally found its target. Grace sat still, every muscle tight, the sound of their voices muffled through the glass. At first, it was calm, polite words, practiced civility. Then the tone changed. Ethan's voice grew colder, sharper, the kind of calm that hides anger beneath restraint. Vanessa's laughter low, deliberate, sliced through the air. Grace couldn't hear every word, but fragments reached her like echoes. "You don't forgive easily, do you? You lied to everyone. Vanessa, you used me first." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of glass, the faint clink of a tumbler being set down too hard. Grace looked away, pretending to type, though her hands had gone still on the keyboard. Whatever was happening behind that door wasn't business. It was history sharp, unresolved and dangerous. When the door finally opened, Vanessa stepped out. Her face was still composed, but her eyes carried that glint, the kind of satisfaction that comes from reopening an old wound. She paused by Grace's desk, looking her over in one smooth glance. "You must be the new secretary," she said. Her tone was polite, but beneath it, something cruel shimmered. Grace stood. "Yes, ma'am." Vanessa smiled faintly. "Well," she murmured, "you're prettier than the last one. Let's hope you last longer." And with that, she turned and walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and a silence that pressed like smoke. Grace stood still for a moment, her pulse uneven. She didn't know why it hurt that tone, that dismissive glance, but it did. She took a slow breath, gathering herself before stepping quietly into Ethan's office. He was still by the window, his back to her, one hand pressed against the glass. The skyline shimmered beyond him, but his reflection looked hollow, lost somewhere between fury and regret. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "should I? You can leave the reports on my desk." He interrupted. His voice was quiet, but not composed. It carried a rough edge, the kind of weariness that came from reopening old scars. Grace nodded and set the files down, but she didn't move to leave. "She was here before," Grace said gently. "The woman from the photograph." Ethan turned, surprised, then sighed, almost defeated. "Yes, Vanessa Moore." He walked to his desk and sank into the chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "She taught me why trust is dangerous." There was no bitterness in his tone this time, only quiet exhaustion. He looked up at her, not as an employee, but as someone safe enough to tell the truth to. "People think betrayal comes with warning signs," he said. "It doesn't. It comes smiling, holding your hand, promising forever." Grace swallowed, her heart tightening. She'd never been betrayed in love, but she knew the ache of disappointment of watching someone you admire fall apart under invisible weight. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "Don't be. Some lessons are worth the pain." Grace wanted to say something more, something that could soften the heaviness in his voice, but words felt fragile in moments like this. So, she did the only thing that came naturally. She walked over to his desk, took the untouched cup of coffee she'd brought earlier, and set a fresh one beside him. A small gesture, but sometimes that's all it takes to remind someone they're not alone. He looked up at her then, and for the briefest second, the cold broke. "Thank you, Grace," he said quietly. When she stepped out of his office, her pulse was still racing, not from fear, but from something else. Something she couldn't quite name. The way his voice had softened on her name. The way she felt the urge to protect him from ghosts that weren't hers to fight. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she pressed a hand to her chest, surprised at the ache she felt there. "I can't get involved. He's my boss." But the truth lingered quiet and undeniable. She already was. That night, as the city lights shimmered against the lake, Grace realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was connection. It was feeling. It was the first dangerous crack in her own heart. The week after Vanessa's unexpected visit felt heavier somehow, like the air in the office carried a weight that words couldn't lift. Ethan Caldwell had withdrawn into silence again. He spoke little, worked more, and though Grace continued to bring him his coffee and steady the chaos around him, something between them had shifted. He had shown her a glimpse of the man beneath the armor, and then, just as quietly, built the wall back up. Grace tried to bury herself in work, but her heart was no longer still. Every glance toward his office door, every quiet moment they shared, carried a pulse she couldn't ignore. It frightened her not the feeling itself, but how deeply it reached. And just as her world in Chicago grew more complicated, another voice came calling one that pulled her back to where everything had begun. It was Saturday morning when the call came. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter of her small apartment, the screen flashing a name she hadn't seen in weeks. Daniel? Her brother? Grace hesitated before answering. She knew that tone he used when he was worried, half protective, half judgmental. "Here we go?" She pressed accept. "Hey, Danny, Grace." His voice was steady, but underneath it, she heard the edge of disapproval she remembered all too well. "I was starting to think Chicago swallowed you whole." Grace smiled faintly, leaning against the counter. "Work's been busy, that's all. How's Mom?" "She's okay," Daniel said, after a pause. "Still tired, still stubborn. She misses you, though. We both do." Grace's chest tightened. "I miss you too." "Do you?" he asked quietly. "Because it sounds like you've got a whole new life up there. Fancy office, big city boss. I don't even know who you're turning into anymore." Grace's breath caught. She knew he didn't mean to hurt her, but the words landed like stones. "Danny, I'm just trying to make things better," she said gently. "For all of us, the bills, Mom's medicine. We're getting by," he interrupted. "We always have. You don't have to lose yourself to save us." Grace turned to the window. Outside, the city glowed with life taxis moving through puddles, skyscrapers reflecting the morning sun. It was a different kind of beauty from home, harder, faster, lonelier. "I'm not losing myself," she said quietly. "I'm just trying to grow." Daniel laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Maybe, but sometimes growing looks a lot like forgetting. Those words stayed with her long after the call ended. She sat at the edge of her small kitchen table, phone still in her hand, eyes unfocused. Was he right? Had she started to forget? The rhythm of the small town mornings, the sound of her mother humming by the window, the smell of Sunday pancakes and church bells, all of it felt like another lifetime. Chicago had given her a chance to prove herself, but it was also teaching her how easy it was to drift away from who she used to be. Am I becoming someone else? The question echoed louder than she wanted it to. That afternoon, she walked down to the small post office on Madison Street. She filled out a money order part of her paycheck and tucked it inside a handwritten letter for her mother. The letter was simple. She wrote about the city, the noise, the endless work. She wrote about how much she missed the garden behind their house, the one her mother tended even when her hands ached. She didn't mention Ethan, not by name, not yet, but she wrote about someone who reminded her that kindness could still exist in unexpected places. At the bottom of the page, she added a line her mother used to say, "Stay kind, stay grounded." And when she sealed the envelope, Grace felt something inside her settle, a quiet sense of balance between who she had been and who she was becoming. That night, she sat by her apartment window with a cup of tea, looking out over the lake. The city lights shimmered on the water like scattered stars. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to slow down, to breathe, to remember why she came here. She wasn't chasing power. She wasn't trying to escape home. She was trying to build a bridge between her mother's strength and her own courage. In that stillness, her phone buzzed again. A text from Daniel. "Got the letter?" Mom smiled for the first time in days. "Thanks, sis." Grace smiled, her eyes misting. For all their differences, family had a way of grounding her in what truly mattered. She realized something then. In a city built on ambition and competition, her heart's greatest strength wasn't her drive. It was her compassion, her ability to care, even when the world tried to harden her. And somewhere deep down, she hoped Ethan Caldwell might one day remember that kind of softness too. You can build empires, but without kindness, they're just walls. As she turned off the light and watched the last trace of sunset fade beyond the skyline, Grace felt more centered than she had in weeks. The storm inside her had quieted, not gone, but calm enough to breathe through. Sometimes, it takes one phone call, one reminder of where you came from, to remember who you still are. And as the night settled over Chicago, Grace Miller whispered a silent promise to herself. No matter how far I go, I'll never forget home. The quiet after Grace's call home didn't last long. Peace, she would learn, was a rare visitor in Ethan Caldwell's world, a luxury that never stayed. Only a week later, the winds began to change. Caldwell Enterprises had always carried an aura of control, every meeting precise, every decision calculated. But lately, Grace could feel something different in the air, a tension. It started as whispers in the hallway, murmurs that quieted when she walked by. Then came the headlines. Victor Hale expands Caldwell, rival holdings. Sources question market integrity. At first, Grace didn't understand. She'd heard Ethan mention Hale only once, a rival executive, ruthless, ambitious. But the look in Ethan's eyes that morning told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't business. It was war. From that moment, the calm rhythm of the office shifted into urgency. Meetings filled the calendar. Phone calls came in at all hours. And Ethan? Ethan grew quieter. The man who already lived half his life behind walls seemed to vanish completely behind them. He stopped sharing even the smallest of smiles, the brief moments of warmth that had begun to flicker between them. His focus became singular: protect the company, protect the legacy. Grace saw it all. She saw the sleepless nights, the furrow in his brow that deepened with every new report. She saw how he pressed his fingertips to his temples when he thought no one was watching. And she saw how, despite all his power, he looked tired. He's carrying too much again. So she stayed, every night, while the others left by 6. Grace remained filing, researching, quietly making sure that Ethan never had to ask twice. She'd have his coffee ready before he reached for it, his next meeting printed before he requested it. He never thanked her in words, but sometimes their eyes met, and that was enough. There were moments, though, when even professionalism couldn't hide the weight between them. Like one evening, the sky outside turning violet, the city lights shimmering across the lake, when Ethan finally looked up from his desk and said softly, "You should go home, Grace." She smiled faintly. "And leave you here alone with those numbers? I don't think so." His gaze lingered on her for a second longer than it should have. There was something in that silence unspoken, uncertain, that neither of them dared name. She busied herself straightening the files, but her pulse quickened. She could feel his presence, the gravity of him, the quiet strength that drew her in, even when she tried to stay grounded. He's my boss. But why does it feel like more? She hated the question, yet it wouldn't leave her alone. Every time she reminded herself of the line she could not cross, fate seemed to erase it a little more. That week, the office became a battlefield. Rumors of insider manipulation spread like smoke, employees whispering about stock fluctuations, leaked memos, secret meetings. Victor Hale, Ethan's rival, was behind it all, orchestrating a quiet campaign to destabilize the company's reputation. Ethan fought back the only way he knew how, with precision, data, and long hours. Grace watched him bury himself in reports, the glow of his computer reflecting in eyes that no longer looked rested. Sometimes, she'd catch him staring at the city skyline, as though searching for answers that didn't exist. And once, just once, she heard him whisper almost too softly to catch, "I won't let him take this away from me." Grace didn't know what to say, so she didn't speak. Instead, she quietly placed a mug of coffee beside him, black, just how he liked it. He didn't look up, but his hand brushed hers for the briefest moment, a touch that said, "Thank you," without sound. Days turned into nights. The world outside blurred. Grace began to forget the sound of her own apartment door closing behind her. There was only the hum of fluorescent lights, the tap of keys, and Ethan's voice low, measured, sometimes strained. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something gentler and more dangerous, a quiet tether pulling 2 lonely hearts through the same storm. One Friday evening, as a storm rolled in from the lake, thunder rattled the windows of the 38th floor. Rain streaked down the glass, turning the city into a watercolor of light. Grace stood by the window, her reflection pale against the dark skyline. Ethan approached, standing just a few feet behind her. Neither spoke. The distance between them was measured in inches, but it felt like a world. Finally. his voice quiet, rough from exhaustion, broke the silence. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Grace turned to him. "To Chicago." He nodded. She thought of home, of her mother's hands, of her brother's warning. And then she thought of this, of the life she was building, the work that made her feel alive, and the man standing before her who had unknowingly changed everything. "No," she said finally, "not once." Ethan looked at her, the faintest flicker of warmth in his eyes, the kind of look that lingered long after it ended. Then, quietly, he turned back to the rain. Grace didn't move for a while. She just watched him, the weight in his shoulders, the solitude that clung to him, and she knew. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, her heart had already crossed the line. He's my boss, but it feels like more. And though she couldn't see it yet, this storm, both outside and within, was only beginning to build. Because sometimes the most dangerous storms aren't the ones that rage around us, but the ones we carry inside. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally arrived. Outside the windows of Caldwell Tower, the Chicago skyline blurred behind streaks of rain and lightning. It was late, well past 9, and the rest of the office had gone dark. Only one light remained on at the top floor, glowing like a small ship in the middle of a restless sea. Grace sat at her desk, a half-empty cup of coffee beside her, the sound of thunder echoing faintly through the glass. She could hear Ethan's voice in his office, low, firm, controlled, ending what sounded like his 10th call of the night. When he finally stepped out, his jacket was off, his tie loosened, and for the first time all day, he looked human. "You should go home," he said quietly. His tone was gentle, but there was exhaustion beneath it, the kind that no amount of sleep could fix. Grace smiled faintly. "You've said that every night this week. I think we both know you don't mean it." Ethan looked at her, a shadow of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but you should still try." Lightning flashed behind them, illuminating the room in quick, silver light. Grace stood, gathering a few files. "If I go home now, you'll stay here until morning. That's hardly fair." He hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "Have you eaten?" Grace blinked, surprised. "Dinner? No. Have you?" He shook his head. "There's takeout in the kitchen, Chinese. I ordered too much." She smiled. "You? Ordering too much? I don't believe it." For the first time in days, the tension between them loosened. They sat at the small conference table, lit only by the soft glow of the desk lamp. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in steady rhythm. They ate in comfortable silence at first, Ethan with his sleeves rolled up, Grace balancing a carton of noodles in one hand. It felt strange, domestic, even as though the world outside had paused just to let them breathe. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "I used to hate nights like this," he said. "The storms, the quiet." Grace looked up, chopsticks frozen midair. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "Because it gave me time to think. And I'm not sure I liked what I found." Grace studied him, the man everyone feared, sitting across from her with shadows in his eyes. He wasn't the Ice King right now. He was just Ethan, a man who had carried too much for too long. "You don't have to be the one holding everything together all the time," she said softly. He gave a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "If I don't, who will? You'd be surprised," she said, smiling gently. "Sometimes people will catch you if you let them." For a moment, their eyes met and the air between them changed. It wasn't sudden, but slow and inevitable, like the way rain finds its way down glass. Neither of them looked away. Grace's heart thudded, loud enough she was sure he could hear it. She didn't move. Neither did he. The silence stretched, charged and fragile. His gaze flicked to her lips, then back to her eyes, searching. Uncertain. It wasn't supposed to happen. She was his secretary. He was her boss. And yet, the world had gone still, the city, the storm, even time itself. Ethan leaned in, just slightly, as if drawn by gravity. Grace's breath caught. Her hand brushed his on the table, Warm against warm. He's my boss. But why does it feel like more? Then a sound shattered the moment. Ethan froze. The light from his desk phone blinked red, urgent. He hesitated for only a second before answering. "Caldwell," he said sharply. Grace watched the color drain from his face as he listened. When he finally hung up, the silence felt colder than the rain outside. He stood slowly, eyes distant, voice clipped. "It's Hale," he said. "Victor Hale. He leaked something to the press." Grace rose to her feet. What kind of leak? Financial reports? Fabricated numbers? "He's claiming we manipulated quarterly returns." He exhaled sharply, jaw tight. "It's going public by morning." Grace felt her stomach twist. "But that's not true. Truth doesn't matter right now." Ethan interrupted, his tone controlled but shaking underneath. "Perception does." He turned toward the window, staring at the skyline blurred by rain. The city lights flickered like fire beneath the storm clouds. Grace took a small step forward. "What can I do?" Ethan didn't look at her. "Nothing? Just go home." "No," she said quietly. That one word, soft, steady, made him turn. Their eyes met again, and this time it wasn't romantic tension, but something deeper: loyalty, courage, defiance. The bond between them had changed shape, forged by something bigger than feeling. Ethan exhaled, the weight of the night pressing against him. "You don't understand what this could do to the company." "To me, I understand," Grace said softly. "But I'm not leaving you to face it alone." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then, slowly, Ethan nodded. The moment of near confession, the almost kiss that could have rewritten everything, was gone, replaced by something stronger. Respect, trust, the quiet, unspoken understanding that sometimes love doesn't begin with a kiss, but with standing beside someone when the world starts to fall apart. Maybe it was never about falling in love. Maybe it's about staying. That night, as the storm raged over Chicago, two souls stood in the same room, close enough to feel each other's heartbeat, but wise enough to know the danger of letting it mean too much. Because in a world built on ambition and power, emotions could be the most dangerous scandal of all. By morning, the city had wrung out the rain, but kept the chill. Grace arrived before sunrise, hair pinned back, coat still damp at the shoulders. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, each floor number a held breath. When the doors opened, the executive floor wasn't quiet. It buzzed not with productivity, but with dread. Phones rang in sharp bursts. The markets had opened. The news had spread. On the screens mounted in the hallway, bold red arrows tilted downward like warnings. A crawl of headlines ran along the bottom: Caldwell stock plummets amid allegations. Sources: Victor Hale, positions for hostile takeover. Grace didn't stop to read the details. She moved straight to Ethan's office, coffee in one hand, her heartbeat in the other. He was already there, jacket on, tie straight, eyes sleepless but clear, a general in a suit, ready for war. "Good morning," she said softly. He looked up just long enough to meet her eyes. "Thank you for coming in early. Legal is assembling in 20 minutes, he said. "Board in 45. I want investor outreach rolling by 9. "I've drafted 3 versions," Grace replied, conservative, neutral, and firm. The firm version names Victor without naming him. That earned the smallest nod approval, and something like pride. "Firm," he said. "We don't flinch." The morning fractured into a dozen moving parts. Grace fielded calls, juggled calendars, triaged incoming emails. Every few minutes, a new alert flashed: another dip in the stock, another analyst prediction, another whispered rumor that made the walls feel thinner. Downstairs, employees gathered in hushes near the glass atrium, faces pale, eyes flicking between their phones and the sky. She could feel their fear even from the 38th floor, the insecurity of paychecks and mortgages and college tuition hanging on numbers none of them could control. At 9:15, HR messaged that the lobby was filling with reporters. Security tightened access. A junior associate cried in the restroom. A senior vice president snapped at a receptionist, then apologized with shaking hands. Grace kept moving, steady, measured, present. Whenever Ethan's door cracked open, she was there with what he needed before he asked the litigation summary, the crisis comms draft, the bullet points for the board. Their eyes met only in fragments, two people swimming in the same rip current, surfacing for air at different times. By late morning, the hostile bid landed like a stone thrown through glass. A formal letter. Cold language, clear intent. Victor Hale wanted control of Caldwell Enterprises. Not tomorrow, today. Ethan read it once, then again. His jaw tightened, but his hands were steady. He looked like the man from the profiles, the Ice King holding a burning match and refusing to flinch. "Get the board in the conference room," he said. 15 minutes. Grace nodded. "Already dialing?" Grace, Ethan asked, catching the change in her breath. She swallowed. "It's PR. They say Victor's spinning a narrative that you over-leveraged after your father's passing, that you're reckless." Ethan's eyes didn't blink. "Of course he is." He reached for the comms draft. Grace slid it to him and added quietly, "We answer with facts, not outrage." He looked at her then, properly, like a man seeing a lighthouse through a wall of rain. "Exactly," he said. "Facts." The board meeting was a flurry of voices, some calm, some shaking. Grace stood at the back, tablet in hand, tracking action items, watching Ethan steer the room, one measured sentence at a time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for drama. He spoke in numbers, then in conviction. This company's value wasn't built overnight, and it won't be erased by one man's ambition. He said, "We are sound. We will prove it." When it ended, no one cheered, but they breathed. Sometimes leadership isn't triumph, it's oxygen. Back at her desk, Grace saw the email the moment it arrived. The subject line was simple. Her name, nothing else. She clicked and felt the floor tilt. Pictures. Her mother's small house in Indiana. Her brother Daniel's truck in the driveway. A shot through the living room window, the faded quilt. The clock that chimed on the hour. The message was brief, almost casual. "Sweet home, isn't it? It would be a shame if your boss's mess spilled over the state line. Walk away, little secretary. Or we might pay a visit." Her first instinct was denial. This couldn't be real. Then the tremor in her hands confirmed. It was. She printed the email, the paper warm against her fingers, and walked straight into Ethan's office without knocking. He looked up. Her face told him everything. What happened? His voice was calm, but the room shifted with it. She handed him the page. He read it once. His expression didn't change, and that, more than anything, told her how furious he was. He reached for the phone, security, now, and legal, then to Grace, softer but iron underneath. "You're going home." She shook her head. "No, Grace." This time her name came like a command. "You're leaving the building, and you're not coming back until I say it's safe. I'll have a car take you to Indiana if you want. Today." Her breath steadied. She thought of her mother's hands, the letter she'd mailed, the promise she'd made to herself. Then she looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm not running, not from this." Something flickered in his gaze. Fear, then respect, then a fiercer kind of care he tried to swallow. "This isn't a request," he said. Hale crossed the line. "I won't have you in his sights. And if I leave now," she replied evenly. "What do I tell my mother when she asks why I ran? That I walked away the minute it got personal. That I left you to fight the thing. I signed up to help you hold." He stood slowly, palms flat on the desk. Lightning hadn't returned, but the air carried its memory. "Your safety is not negotiable. Neither is my integrity." Security arrived, then legal, then IT. The email was preserved, traced, escalated. There would be filings. There would be consequences. But in that small space between protocol and justice, two people stood facing each other with the kind of honesty few offices ever see. Ethan exhaled. Then we do this together, he said finally. But you don't walk alone anywhere. Not today. Grace nodded. Deal? He picked up the phone again, voice sharpening into command. He coordinated with counsel, instructed PR, authorized surveillance for her family's home. Every order was precise. Every sentence said what he couldn't: I will protect what matters. When the room emptied, he looked at her and lowered his voice. This is my fight, he said. She held his gaze. Then it's mine too. For a moment, the noise outside faded: the falling stock, the shouting anchors, the emails that stung like wasps. There was only the simple truth between them: he would shield her if he could. She would stand beside him even if he couldn't. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing who you stand with when fear arrives. The day stretched into evening, into night, then into a kind of time that had no name. Numbers wavered, then steadied. Employees stopped whispering and started working. And though the bid still loomed like a black flag on the horizon, the building felt less like a target and more like a team. At midnight, Grace walked the quiet corridor with a stack of revised statements. Through the glass, she saw Ethan by the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared against the dark. She paused, then stepped inside and set the papers on his desk. Final draft, she said, clear, firm, and not afraid. He looked at her, really looked, and the ice around his expression softened just enough to let warmth through. Good, he said. We're not afraid. The attack had arrived. The numbers had fallen. The threats had drawn blood. But in the heart of the tower, something stronger than fear took root. Not bravado, not denial, but the quiet power of two steady voices refusing to be bullied into silence. And as the clock struck 1, Grace Miller repeated the promise she had made that morning, not to a company, not to a title, but to herself. I'm not running. Not from this. The week after Victor Hale's attack was one of quiet recovery. The company held, the board steadied, and Ethan Caldwell, though still burdened, had proven once again why people called him unbreakable. But power, Grace was learning, attracted more than enemies. It also summoned ghosts. That morning, the city was wrapped in sunlight, the kind that made even the glass towers look softer. Grace arrived early, as always, the rhythm of work giving her purpose after days of tension. She had barely settled at her desk when Linda from HR appeared beside her with a knowing glance. Brace yourself, Linda whispered. He didn't warn you. Did he? Grace frowned. Warn me about what? Linda only smiled, that tight, sympathetic kind of smile reserved for someone about to face a storm of a different kind. About her. The elevator doors slid open, and Martha Caldwell stepped into the executive floor. She moved like a woman who owned every inch of the space she walked through. Elegant, poised, every gesture deliberate. Her tailored navy dress fit perfectly. Her pearls caught the morning light. There was no mistaking who she was, Ethan's mother, the matriarch behind the empire. Grace stood instinctively, her pulse quickening. She'd seen photos of Martha in business magazines: the philanthropist, the board advisor, the woman who had once run the company before passing it to her son. In person, she was formidable. Martha's eyes landed on Grace with the kind of gaze that could appraise a person's worth in a single glance. Miss Miller, I presume, she said smoothly. Yes. Mrs. Caldwell, Grace replied, offering her hand. Martha shook it polite, cool. Her smile was gracious but distant, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm here to see my son, she said, but before that, I thought we might talk. Grace hesitated for only a second before gesturing toward the small conference room beside the office. Of course. Would you like some coffee? Martha's smile tightened. Black, no sugar, just like Ethan's. They sat across from each other at the glass table. Outside, the city hummed faintly, but in that room, time seemed to still. For a moment, Martha said nothing. She simply studied Grace, her simple blouse, her calm posture, the quiet way she carried herself. Finally, she spoke. My son doesn't let people close easily, she began, He never has. But lately, I've noticed changes, small ones, but unmistakable. Grace met her gaze, steady but respectful. Changes can be good, Mrs. Caldwell. Sometimes, Martha agreed. But sometimes they are distractions. Grace said nothing. I imagine you've seen how much pressure he's under, Martha continued, voice smooth as silk, running this company, carrying his father's legacy, fending off vultures like Victor Hale. She smiled faintly. It's a great deal for any man, especially one who doesn't need emotional complications clouding his judgment. Grace understood then this wasn't a conversation. It was a test. She set down her pen and folded her hands. I'm not here to complicate Mr. Caldwell's life, she said calmly. I'm here to do my job and do it well. Martha tilted her head slightly, the corner of her mouth curling. I'm sure you are. But forgive me, I've seen women mistake proximity for importance before. Grace felt the sting of the words, but she refused to flinch. Her mother had taught her that silence, when used well, could be stronger than defense. Finally, she replied, voice steady and low, I don't need to be important, Mrs. Caldwell. I just need to be useful. Ethan, Mr. Caldwell has earned everything he has, and I respect that. The best thing I can do for him is make his days a little easier, not harder. For the first time, something shifted in Martha's expression, just a flicker, but it was there. She leaned back, studying Grace again, this time less like an adversary and more like someone worth understanding. You're different, she said quietly. Not what I expected. Grace smiled gently. I get that a lot. Martha's lips curved into something that almost resembled a real smile. She stood, adjusting the strap of her purse. Well, she said, Ethan's waiting, but I'm glad we spoke. She paused at the door, turning back one last time. Miss Miller, she added softly, loyalty is a rare quality in this city. Don't lose it no matter how difficult things get. Grace nodded. I won't. When the door closed, Grace let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly, but her heart was steady. It wasn't the words that stayed with her. It was the look, the one Martha had given her just before leaving, half doubt, half respect. Ethan found her a few minutes later, still standing by the window. She came to see you, didn't she? He asked. Grace smiled faintly. Let's just say she has questions. He sighed. She always does. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm outside their lives had calmed, but something else was beginning to form a new kind of understanding, born not of words, but of endurance. Ethan looked at her, curious. And what did you tell her? Grace met his gaze, unwavering. The truth, she said softly, that you don't need saving, just someone to stand beside you. He nodded slowly, a flicker of warmth crossing his face. Then she met the right person. As the day stretched on, the office returned to its rhythm. Martha Caldwell's visit became just another event on the schedule, yet Grace felt its weight long after. Because sometimes, it isn't the battles that test a person. It's the moments of quiet scrutiny when someone looks into your life and asks, without saying a word, who are you really? Grace had answered the question not with charm or defense, but with truth, and that, perhaps, was what began to change everything. When Martha's car pulled away from the building that afternoon, she sat in silence, the city rolling by outside her window. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. For the first time in a long while, she found herself thinking not about legacy or reputation, but about the quiet strength of a young woman who refused to be intimidated. She's not what I expected, Martha murmured to herself, but maybe that's exactly what Ethan needs. The weeks after Martha Caldwell's visit brought a strange kind of calm, the kind that comes just before something breaks. On the surface, everything appeared steady again. The markets had stabilized. Victor Hale's attacks had quieted. The board was back to its meetings, and the company to its rhythm. But underneath the calm, Something was shifting. Ethan Caldwell had grown colder. The man who once allowed brief glimmers of warmth, a quiet thank you, a shared smile. A late-night conversation had retreated behind his walls again. Every word he spoke was measured, every look distant. He'd begun to move like a man holding his breath. Grace noticed it immediately. At first, she told herself it was stress, the pressure, the scrutiny, the endless demands of leadership. But the change ran deeper than that. He began canceling meetings without warning. He answered questions with clipped sentences. He worked through weekends, sometimes forgetting to eat. And when Grace brought him coffee or stayed late to help, his thanks grew quieter, then vanished altogether. She told herself not to take it personally. He was protecting himself, not punishing her. But it still hurt. One evening, after another long day of silence, Grace sat alone at her desk, staring at the city lights through the glass. Her reflection looked tired, not just from the work, but from the weight of caring for someone who seemed determined not to be cared for. You can't reach someone who doesn't want to be found, and yet she stayed, because leaving felt like betrayal, and staying felt like heartbreak. That Friday, Ethan called her into his office. His tone was professional, but his eyes, they were restless, like a storm behind glass. "I need the investor reports by tomorrow morning," he said, "and revise the quarterly projections." Grace blinked. "Tomorrow's Saturday. I'm aware." She hesitated. "Ethan, you haven't slept properly in days. Maybe we can—" "Grace," he interrupted sharply. "Just handle it." Something inside her cracked. The exhaustion, the unspoken feelings, the weeks of being invisible, it all surged up at once. She set the file down on his desk, her voice trembling but clear. "No, I can't just handle it. Ethan, you hired me to organize your life, not to care about it, but somewhere along the way. I did both." He looked up at her, startled, not angry, not defensive, just caught. She took a shaky breath. "I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion. I've watched you shut everyone out, even the people trying to help. And I've stood here, pretending that it doesn't matter to me. But it does. Ethan, it matters more than it should." Ethan's expression hardened, but only for a moment. He turned away, walking toward the window. The skyline glowed beyond him, cold and distant. "You don't understand what this takes," he said quietly. "Every decision I make carries thousands of lives with it. Every mistake, one slip, one wrong call, and it all falls apart." Grace stepped closer. "You're not alone in this." He turned sharply. "Aren't I?" His voice broke through the calm like glass under pressure. "Every person I've trusted, Hale, Vanessa, even my own board has used it against me. Trust is a weapon in this world. Grace. And I can't afford to hand anyone the blade." Grace's heart clenched. "I'm not them," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "That's what scares me." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt electric, charged with everything they hadn't said. Grace gathered her courage. "Then maybe I should leave," she whispered, "if my being here makes things harder for you." He turned before she could finish. "Don't," he said, his voice low, desperate, stripped of control. "Don't leave me now." Grace froze. In that single sentence, she heard everything he'd spent months hiding: the loneliness, the exhaustion, the fear of being left behind. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan," he ran a hand through his hair, the mask slipping completely now. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Any of it. The company, the people, you." Grace's eyes softened. "You don't have to know how to do everything," she said. "You just have to let someone help you." He shook his head. "I don't know how to need someone without losing control." She smiled faintly, tears welling but not falling. "Then maybe it's not about control. Maybe it's about trust." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her as if seeing something he'd spent years avoiding. The silence between them grew heavy, then light again, like the air before dawn. "I'm terrified," he said finally. of losing what I've built, of letting someone in, of what happens if I don't. Grace's voice trembled. We're all afraid, Ethan, but if fear keeps you from feeling, then what's left for a moment? Neither of them moved. The space between them felt fragile like glass that might shatter or become something beautiful. He exhaled, shoulders relaxing, the weight of years seeming to lift just slightly. Grace, he said softly, you've done more than organize my life. You've reminded me I still have one. Grace felt her heart ache at the sound of it, the honesty, the surrender. For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the Ice King. He was just a man standing in front of her, afraid and unguarded, and she was the one person who refused to walk away. Sometimes, the breaking point isn't destruction. It's the moment the heart finally admits it can feel. That night, the building went quiet again. But for the first time, the silence between them wasn't distance. It was something closer, fragile, human, real. In a world built on control, love begins the moment we dare to lose it. The day after Ethan's confession, the air in the office felt lighter, not peaceful, not yet, but lighter, like a window had been cracked open after months of being sealed shut. Something unspoken had changed between them. It wasn't romance, not in words or gestures, but in presence, a quiet understanding that they were no longer two people surviving separately, but two who had chosen to fight the same fight. Caldwell Enterprises still sat under a shadow. Victor Hale's lies had slowed, but not stopped. Every headline still carried undertones of doubt. Every investor call felt like walking a tightrope over ice. Ethan's composure had returned, though his eyes still carried the fatigue of sleepless nights. And Grace steady, perceptive. Grace refused to stand by and let the story end this way. She'd seen her mother face illness with faith, and her brother Daniel face hardship with grit. They'd taught her something simple: when life corners you, you don't crumble, you calculate. That thought stayed with her the next evening, long after the others had gone home. She sat at her desk, scrolling through financial reports, internal memos, trade logs, endless numbers that blurred together. Something about them didn't feel right. Her eyes caught a small discrepancy: transaction codes tied to one of Hale's shell companies, showing up in patterns too precise to be random. At first, she dismissed it, but the more she compared, the clearer the picture became. It wasn't just manipulation, it was orchestration. Daniel would have seen this. Her brother, the one who could rebuild a broken engine just by listening to it. He'd always said, patterns don't lie. People do. Grace leaned closer to the screen, heart racing. The same offshore account appeared in multiple reports under different names, different dates, but identical signatures. It was evidence, maybe even proof. She didn't hesitate. She printed the reports and marched straight into Ethan's office. He looked up from a pile of documents, exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. Grace, I think I found something, she said. He frowned, skeptical. What kind of something? The kind that could end this, she replied, setting the papers before him. Ethan studied the sheets, his eyes narrowing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the hum of the city outside. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both surprise and admiration. These codes, where did you find them? Cross-referencing vendor payments, Grace said. Some of them reroute through an account that doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Hale's partner firm in Delaware. He's been moving assets, inflating values, and using our name to cover the trail. Ethan leaned back, a slow exhale leaving his chest. For the first time in weeks, the ice in his expression began to crack, not from emotion this time, but from possibility. Grace, he said quietly, this could be it. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Then, let's finish what he started. The next few days blurred into a montage of motion, quiet, relentless, methodical. Grace worked alongside Ethan's tech and legal teams, tracking digital trails through the company's archives, late-night conference calls, encrypted files, silent hours under flickering fluorescent lights. She'd come in at dawn and leave close to midnight, fueled by adrenaline and black coffee. The exhaustion that once felt crushing now felt purposeful. Ethan was there too, every step of the way. Gone was the cold detachment that once defined him. He moved with clarity now, anchored by something greater than pride partnership. When Grace's concentration wavered, he'd appear beside her with a quiet word, a cup of coffee, or simply a presence that steadied her nerves. And when Ethan's anger threatened to overtake him, it was Grace's calm voice that kept him grounded. They were opposites in motion, his precision to her intuition, his strategy to her empathy, but together. They formed something balanced, something whole. One night, around 2 a.m, Grace sat surrounded by printouts, her eyes aching from the screen. Ethan walked in, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a quiet determination in his step. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." She replied without looking up. He smiled faintly, the rare, human smile that reached his eyes now. Fair point. Then suddenly, her fingers froze. "There," she whispered. "Look at this." Ethan leaned over her shoulder. On the screen, a transaction ID glowed faintly, connecting Hale's account directly to a board member's trust fund. A name Ethan knew, a betrayal close to home. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "He's been using us from the inside." Grace nodded. "But now we can prove it." The next morning, their lawyers filed a motion with the SEC. By afternoon, federal investigators were reviewing evidence. By evening, Victor Hale's empire, the one built on deception, began to crumble. There were no celebrations, no cheers or champagne, just the sound of steady breathing, shared relief, and the quiet click of a final email, sent. Grace leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. Across the table, Ethan looked at her eyes, soft, grateful. "You saved this company," he said. Grace shook her head. "We did. Besides, I just connected the dots. You're the one who gave me the space to see them." Ethan's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them again, not just admiration, but respect, and perhaps something deeper, too. He said quietly, "My father used to tell me it's not about winning the fight. It's about earning the right to keep standing. You helped me remember that." Grace smiled. "Then let's keep standing." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of months finally easing. Outside, dawn began to break over Chicago, gold light spilling between towers, washing away the night. The war was not over, but the tide had turned, and for the first time, victory didn't feel lonely. Because sometimes, partnership isn't found in grand gestures or easy moments. It's born in the quiet hours, when two weary souls refuse to give up, not on the fight, and not on each other. When life tests you, the narrator whispers, remember, the storm isn't there to break you. It's there to reveal who's willing to stand beside you through it. The morning after the evidence was sent, the world moved fast, too fast for anyone to stop it. News outlets picked up the story before sunrise. By 8 o'clock, federal cars lined the street outside Hale International. By 9, agents in dark suits were moving through its glass doors. The storm that Victor Hale had started had finally turned on him. Grace stood beside Ethan in his office, watching the live coverage on the muted television, flashing lights, security tape, a name once synonymous with power, now scrolling across the screen like a cautionary tale. She glanced at Ethan. He wasn't smiling. There was no triumph in his face, only quiet relief. "Is it over?" she asked softly. He nodded once. For him, yes. He turned away from the screen, looking out across the Chicago skyline. For the first time in months, his shoulders seemed lighter. But Grace could still sense the weight of everything they'd endured, not just the fight for the company, but the fight within himself. Later that afternoon, the call came. The federal agents wanted Ethan Caldwell present for the official statement, a symbolic gesture. The man who had refused to bow to corruption would now stand as witness to its end. Grace went with him, not because she needed to, but because she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The Hale International building loomed in front of them, stripped of its usual shine. Reporters crowded the sidewalk, shouting questions into the cold spring air. Cameras flashed like lightning, hungry for a glimpse of the fallen king. Ethan walked through it all with quiet composure, neither arrogance nor vengeance in his step, only dignity. Grace followed a few paces behind, her heart pounding with something between pride and awe. Inside, the air was heavy with tension and fluorescent light. Boxes lined the hallway's files, computers, evidence. Federal agents moved with efficiency, their voices low, clipped, and there, in his corner office, sat Victor Hale. He looked different now, smaller somehow, though his suit was still perfect, his hair still in place. Only his eyes betrayed him. They had lost their gleam, replaced by something colder disbelief. When Ethan entered, Hale's head lifted slowly. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was not the meeting of rivals. Now it was the meeting of two men who had built their lives on control, each in his own way. "You came to gloat," Hale said finally, his tone dry. Ethan shook his head. "No, I came to understand why. Why what? Why a man who had everything would burn it all down? Because I could," he said simply. "Because power without risk is boring." Grace's breath caught. The casual cruelty in his voice chilled the room. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "And the people you hurt. The families, the employees, the ones who trusted you." Hale's smirk deepened. "They'll move on. They always do. But you." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're different, aren't you? Caldwell. You play the hero, the man of integrity, but give it time. You'll lose everything one day. The company, the people, maybe even her. Love makes you weak." Ethan didn't react at first. He simply stood there, calm, still like a man who had finally learned the difference between power and peace. Then, quietly, he said the words that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. "No," he replied, his voice steady. "Love doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." For a moment, the words hung in the air, not triumphant, not dramatic, but true. Hale looked away first. The agent stepped in then, reading him his rights, guiding him toward the door. Ethan didn't watch him leave. He didn't need to. The battle was over. Grace followed Ethan outside, the cool wind sweeping across the plaza. The reporters were still there, but their questions blurred into background noise. He stopped at the edge of the steps, looking up at the afternoon sky, sunlight breaking through the gray. For the first time in months, Grace saw him breathe, not the shallow breath of survival, but the deep inhale of someone remembering what life felt like beyond war. She stood beside him in silence, the two of them framed against the city they had fought to protect. No words were needed. The victory wasn't in Hale's downfall. It was in standing, unbroken, side by side. Later, back at the office, Grace brought him a cup of coffee just as she had on the very first day. Ethan looked up, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "For what?" "For staying," he replied. "For believing in me when I didn't." Grace looked down at her hands, then back at him. "You taught me something too," she said softly. "Oh, that strength doesn't mean being untouchable. It means being brave enough to care anyway." Ethan's eyes held hers, the smallest smile touching his face. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "we both learned how to be human again." They sat there for a moment, not as CEO and secretary, not as survivors of a storm, but as two souls who had walked through fire and found something worth keeping. Outside, Chicago moved on buses, laughter, life, but inside that quiet office, the world felt still, like peace had finally come home. Because in the end, victory isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about proving to yourself that love, kindness, and courage can survive even the hardest battles. And for Ethan Caldwell and Grace Miller, the war was over, but their story was just beginning. Love doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. A year had passed since the fall of Victor Hale, 12 months that felt both long and fleeting, filled with rebuilding, forgiveness, and quiet beginnings. Ethan Caldwell was no longer the man headlines once called the Ice King of Chicago. His company had recovered, his name was restored, but more importantly, his heart had thawed. Grace Miller, once the small-town girl who walked into a glass tower, clutching a resume and a paper cup of coffee, was now something far more than an assistant. She was his equal, his anchor, his reminder that kindness could rebuild what ambition had nearly destroyed. It was a Saturday morning in late June. The sky above Lake Michigan shimmered in soft hues of gold and blue, the kind of light that makes the world seem newly washed. A light breeze stirred the surface of the water, carrying the laughter of guests and the faint scent of summer lilies. On a quiet stretch of shore just outside the city, white chairs lined a small clearing, their ribbons fluttering gently. A simple wooden arch, hand-built by Daniel. Grace's brother stood at the edge of the lake, draped with ivy and soft roses. This was no grand affair, no society wedding printed in glossy magazines. It was intimate, honest, just family, friends, and two people who had already weathered more storms than most marriages see in a lifetime. Martha Caldwell sat near the front, dressed in a pale lavender suit. Her elegance was unchanged, but the sharpness in her eyes had softened. When Grace passed by earlier, Martha had taken her hands and said quietly, "You proved me wrong, and I've never been so grateful to be wrong." Grace had smiled, her throat tight. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." Martha squeezed her hand gently. "Call me Martha, now." As the guests murmured and the officiant adjusted his notes, the music changed that gentle cue that made everyone rise. Grace appeared at the edge of the aisle, sunlight catching in her hair, a faint breeze tugging at the veil that framed her face. She wasn't wearing diamonds or silk. Her dress was simple cream lace, soft and flowing, the kind that moved like water when she walked. In her hands, a small bouquet of white tulips, her mother's favorite. Daniel stood beside her, looking both proud and emotional. He had argued, months ago, that he wouldn't cry. Now, his voice was already thick as he whispered, "You ready?" Sis Grace smiled through the shimmer of tears. More than ready. As Daniel walked her down the aisle, Grace caught sight of Ethan waiting beneath the arch. He wore a classic black suit, his tie soft gray, his posture steady, but his expression, it was something else entirely. All the control, all the composure that once defined him had given way to something simple and real. He looked at her, the way a man looks at sunrise after a long night quiet awe. Quiet gratitude. When Daniel placed her hand in Ethan's, the world seemed to still. Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. The officiant began to speak, but the words barely reached them. For Ethan and Grace, this wasn't ceremony. It was closure. It was the echo of every battle, every sleepless night, every whispered, "Don't leave me now." When it came time for their vows, Ethan was the first to speak. He took her hands, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "Grace," he said, "you walked into my life on an ordinary morning, a stranger with courage I didn't recognize then. You reminded me that strength isn't about power or control. It's about compassion. You taught me that love doesn't make us weak, it makes us whole. And for that, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Grace's eyes shimmered, her smile trembling as she began her vow. "Ethan," she whispered, "I came to Chicago looking for a job. What I found was a man who hides his heart behind walls and still somehow manages to protect everyone around him. You taught me that even the strongest people need someone to stay, and I promise, no matter how hard the world gets, I'll be that someone. Not to fix you, just to love you." When they exchanged rings, A ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, a single beam of gold spilling across the water, catching the silver bands as they slid onto each other's fingers. Grace's voice caught as she whispered, "With this ring," Ethan finished softly, "the storm ends." And when the officiant finally said the words, "You may kiss the bride," it felt less like an ending, and more like the beginning of everything that came after. Their kiss was gentle, reverent, filled with all the quiet gratitude of two souls who had fought their way toward peace. Applause rippled through the small crowd, Martha wiping her eyes discreetly, Daniel cheering far too loudly, and even Linda from HR sniffling into a napkin she'd sworn she wouldn't need. The reception was held nearby under a white tent trimmed with fairy lights. Children laughed, glasses clinked. Ethan's usual formality melted completely as he twirled Grace in the middle of the dance floor, their laughter mingling with the evening breeze. Martha watched from her seat, smiling quietly. To her right, Daniel was telling anyone who'd listen that he had single-handedly built the arch and nearly missed his flight home because of it. As the sun dipped lower, the lake turned to gold, reflecting the light of a world that finally seemed at peace. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not the kind found in stories of glass slippers or crowns. It was better than that. It was real. Because sometimes love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up through fear, through failure, through every storm that life dares to send. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan and Grace stood at the edge of the lake, hand in hand, watching the last light fade into dusk. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter, mingling with the soft rhythm of the water. Ethan turned to her, eyes soft. "So," he said quietly, "Mrs. Caldwell." Grace laughed, the sound warm as the twilight. "Still getting used to that." He smiled. "Get used to forever?" Above them, the last clouds parted the sunlight, returning once more, just as it always did after every storm. On the shores of Lake Michigan, under a sky reborn, two hearts finally found their calm. The girl who came for a job had found a home, and the man once feared for his power learned that true strength lives in love. 2 years had passed since the wedding by Lake Michigan, 2 years of quiet transformation, both within the city and within the hearts of the people who once stood on opposite sides of ambition and fear. Chicago had moved forward, as cities always do. The storms faded into memory, and so did the headlines. But within the tall glass walls of Caldwell Enterprises, something far more enduring had taken root. Grace Caldwell, once the nervous young woman clutching her resume and a cup of coffee, now sat at the head of a polished oak conference table, leading a meeting of her own. Her title read Vice President of Community Initiatives, but her purpose went deeper than any title could express. She had turned what was once a corner office of cold efficiency into a space of warmth and purpose, lined with photos of the company's new projects, scholarships for students, outreach programs, small business grants, and the new community health center on the south side. Her voice, calm and confident, guided the discussion. "Impact isn't just about numbers," she told her team. "It's about people. Let's never forget that." When the meeting ended, Grace stepped to the window. Below her, the city gleamed beneath the morning sun. She smiled, one hand instinctively resting against the soft curve of her belly, a quiet secret, not so secret anymore. She was 6 months along. The baby had already begun to shape her days from the way she walked to the way she thought about the future. And somehow, every time she felt that tiny heartbeat flutter within her, she remembered the woman she used to be, the one who took a chance on a train to Chicago, not knowing that life had far greater plans. That afternoon, she stopped by Ethan's office. It looked different now, still sleek, still orderly, but softer somehow. A photo of the two of them by the lake sat on his desk beside a tiny pair of knitted baby shoes Martha had given them for luck. Ethan looked up as she entered, his expression breaking into that familiar, quiet smile that still made her heart skip. "Madam Vice President," he said teasingly. "How was the meeting?" Grace rolled her eyes, laughing, productive, inspiring, and only slightly interrupted by your son kicking through half of it. He chuckled, standing to meet her halfway, already impatient, definitely your side of the family. They stood by the window together, looking down at the lake shimmering in the distance. It was the same view where so much had begun, yet everything about it felt new. Ethan slipped an arm gently around her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she admitted, leaning against him, "but happy. And maybe a little terrified." "Good," he said softly. "Means it's real." Ethan Caldwell had changed too. Gone was the man who ruled through fear and precision. In his place stood a leader who inspired through compassion, who listened, who cared, who understood that power meant responsibility, not control. The employees had begun calling him the Quiet Storm, not because he was cold, but because he moved with calm strength, reshaping the company from the inside out. Where there had once been walls of hierarchy, now there were open doors. Where there had once been competition, there was collaboration. And whenever someone asked him what caused the shift, he always said the same thing. "Grace taught me that leadership begins with kindness." Later that evening, they attended a charity gala, one of Grace's new initiatives, funding education programs for underprivileged youth. The event was small, elegant, filled with laughter and warmth rather than corporate posturing. Martha Caldwell, now proudly grandma-to-be, charmed every guest within reach, her once intimidating aura replaced by grace of another kind. Daniel, of course, manned the dessert table, telling every server that his sister's chocolate cake recipe was better than anything catered, and somewhere between speeches and soft jazz. Ethan found Grace by the balcony. The city lights reflected off her face, the glow of motherhood and purpose blending with the soft gleam of gold from her wedding ring. He reached for her hand. "Do you ever think about that first day?" he asked. "The one at Union Station." She smiled. "Every time I drink coffee." He laughed quietly, eyes soft. "You were terrified." "I was," she said. "But something about that morning felt right. Like the beginning of a story I didn't know I was already a part of." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the soft hum of the same city that had tested them, shaped them, and, in the end, healed them. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "You know," she whispered, "for all the storms we've been through, I wouldn't change a single one." Ethan smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Neither would I. 2 years ago. They were strangers on opposite sides of a world defined by ambition and fear. Now, they were partners not just in love, but in purpose. Their journey had not erased their scars. It had made them sacred. A few months later, on a bright morning in early spring, Grace held a newborn son in her arms. Tiny fingers, steady heartbeat, eyes just like his father's. Ethan stood beside her, speechless, his hand trembling as he touched the baby's cheek. "He's perfect," Grace whispered. Ethan nodded. "He's ours." And in that quiet hospital room, filled with sunlight, they both knew this was the true beginning. Because sometimes, life doesn't give us what we expect. It gives us what we need: people who challenge us, love that heals us, and the courage to become who we were meant to be. Grace came to Chicago looking for a job, but what she found was something far greater: a love that rebuilt 2 hearts, a purpose that outlasted fear, and a legacy that would last forever. She came to Chicago looking for a job, and found something far greater: a love that rebuilt 2 hearts, and a legacy that would last forever. In the story of Grace and Ethan, we find more than romance. We find a reflection of life itself. It reminds us that strength isn't about building walls. It's about daring to open the heart again after pain. That kindness, though often overlooked, can change even the coldest souls. Grace walked into a city ruled by power and left her mark through compassion. Ethan learned that true leadership isn't measured in wealth or control, but in empathy, the courage to listen, to forgive, and to love. For those of us who have lived long enough to know both success and loss, this story whispers a simple truth: it's never too late to begin again. It's never too late to soften, to trust, to care. Because in the end, what we build with love, not money, not fear, is what truly lasts. Love doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories today. If Grace and Ethan's journey touched your heart, reminded you of the power of love, or gave you a reason to believe, again, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, courage, and second chances to life. And remember, every story we share begins with a heart willing to listen, just like yours. Stay inspired, stay kind, and we'll meet again in the next story.